we're super honored. Steve has brought in tonight his former associate, longtime friend, Mike McCurry, who many of you will remember as the former press secretary to Bill Clinton. He also was the co-chairman on the U.S. presidential debates commission. So without further ado, I'll get out of the way, and we'll have these guys have a little chat about what's going on in the current world situation, and we'll open up some polling, and then the last part of it will be Q&A. So you guys feel free to ask anything. The Q&A function should be available on the bottom of your screen. Type in the questions, and we'll present those to these guys towards the end. So I will get out of the way and let you guys do what you do.
Yeah, thanks so much. Mike, thanks for doing this. Welcome virtually back to Singapore with the American Club and the American Association and the American Chamber of Commerce here. Wanted to go right in and kind of ask you a couple of different questions to help us understand where we are today. And to do that, we need to know where we've been, and then really open it up for a Q&A and give the members a chance to talk. So first thing I want to ask you is, and I'm going to see if the screen share works, pull up this picture of you from the podium in the briefing room and ask you two questions. One, how did you get to be White House press secretary? And two, what did you see the role being when you were White House press secretary?
Well, first, let me comment on the picture that you're showing there. That was one of the first briefings in which the subject of Monica Lewinsky, the young White House intern, came up. And it was very unusual to have all these camera crews standing right up there next to you on the podium. It was the first time that it ever happened. And of course, they're sitting there watching the sweat drain down my cheeks as I was answering all the questions. But it brings back some very weird memories of what it was like in those days. But I became White House press secretary. I had had a long career in politics. I had worked in the U.S. Senate as a press secretary, had been the chief communications person for the Democratic National Committee. So I'd had a bit of a track record. And I had worked, interestingly, against Bill Clinton in the primaries in 1992. I worked for Senator Bob Kerrey when he ran. So when Clinton got elected, I said, well, no chance am I ever going to work in the Clinton administration because I worked for the guy who ran against him. But lo and behold, I had a good friend, Tom Donilon, who ended up going on to become National Security Advisor under Obama. Had a big career, but he became chief of staff to Warren Christopher at the State Department. And he prevailed, and I had some help from George Stephanopoulos, who some people may know as now a TV host. And they argued, they said, look, Mike McCurry's a good guy. He's been around a long time. We should give him a job. So I was hired to become the chief spokesman at the U.S. State Department when Warren Christopher was then the Secretary of State. I did that job for 2 years. And Hillary Clinton tells me the story that they were watching. At the time, there was no televised briefing at the White House. But the State Department briefing was televised, and it used to be carried by C-SPAN late at night, presumably so nursing mothers would have something to watch. But Hillary told me they were sitting in bed, and Bill Clinton was doing a crossword puzzle, and they were watching my briefing at the State Department, and Hillary nudged him and said, this is the guy that you should have at the White House as press secretary. So she takes credit for having put the idea in the president's head, and I was shortly after asked to come over to the White House in 1995 after they had kind of a staff shakeup, and Leon Panetta became the chief of staff. So I arrived there in 1995, having spent 2 years at the State Department. So I had been doing a regular briefing, but it was really that experience. It was the working at the State Department and doing the briefings there that I think got me noticed over at the White House. And it all went on from there. And I had 4 good years, typically longer. A White House press secretary usually lasts about 2.5 years. That's the average duration. But I was there for 4 years, and I had a bonus year in my last year because we had the scandal going on with the White House intern. So it wasn't easy to leave in the middle of something like that, but it had a pretty good run, all in all.
And what was the job of the White House, press secretary? Is it just standing at the podium and answering questions, or is it more to it than that, or should it be more to it?
Well, I can tell you what the job should be, and then you can ask the question whether that's what it is today, because I think that job has changed quite a bit. But during the years that I had the job, it was a lot of hard work. I mean, you got up in the morning, you read the newspapers, you listened to the radio, you listened to, I used to kind of like start absorbing news at about 5 in the morning. I listened to the BBC, the Beeb, and then listened to NPR, and then read all the newspapers that landed on my front porch in the morning. And so by the time I left to go down to the White House at 7 o'clock in the morning, I pretty much knew 90% of what was going to be, on the minds of the White House press corps that day, and started thinking of the answers that I would give. But then we would go through the morning, we'd had senior staff meetings, we'd be, processing a lot of information from other parts of the White House. I would sort of rehearse some of what I would say in response to the questions that we were anticipating. And then just a lot of, for the most of the morning, I just read lots of memos. I read lots of papers. I went down to the secure room in the basement of the White House and read all the classified intelligence so that I would mostly not, obviously I was not going to talk about that stuff, but I wanted to make sure I knew what was really going on so I would never inadvertently say something that was not true. And I think that's the hardest part of the job, is to verify the information that you have and make sure that what you're saying is accurate, because that the killer for a press secretary is to stand up and say something that's not true. You cannot lie. Now, I famously once said, sometimes you have to tell the truth a little slowly because things that you can't really blab about, in public, but it prevents you from sort of steering the press corps away from what is the truth, because you have to kind of keep them aimed at accuracy and the truth. And because it's in the interest of the White House to do that. You want them to report all the good stuff you're doing. They want accurate information so that they can report to their readers. So in theory, the equation is pretty well balanced. Both sides want to get the story right. But when it goes wrong is when people start to twist the truth a little bit, or spin too much, or try to pretend things are all fine when in fact they're not. And so candor in the job is a very important element. You've got to have to be reliable for the press corps and to be trusted by them. You have to be seen as someone who's pretty much a straight shooter and tells the truth. And that is not always very, very easy to do. There are a lot of pressures. There are people at the White House that say, why don't you go out and, you're not putting up a strong enough defense. You're not putting up a strong enough story, but you stretch your credibility if you do that sometimes. And I think that's when people start getting in trouble. We've seen instances of that. And the job, frankly, has changed a great, great deal. I've talked to some of my successors, people who have had the job since I had it, Ari Fleischer, Dana Perino, people who worked for President Bush. And the one thing that is so totally different is the whole role that social media plays now, and the fact that, the press cycle just goes 24/7 all the time. In the 1990s, when I was press secretary, there was a rhythm to the day. You kind of went through your briefing, you answered questions, you watched the network news at night when it came on at 6:30. You tried to correct anything that you didn't think was reported accurately, and then you could go home and the day was over. But now the White House press operation is literally 24/7. It goes all the time. So I didn't have to worry about Twitter. I didn't have to worry about Facebook. I didn't have to worry about any of the things that now I think drive a lot of the coverage of the White House. So the job itself now is pretty different from the time that I had it in the 1990s.
Ask you one question. We'll go to the future, but I'll ask you one question about Bill Clinton. I mean, Donald Trump is famously basically his own press secretary. What interaction did you have with the president before you'd have a briefing? Did you talk to him about policy? Did you help shape policy, or did he tell you what to say and then you went out and said it?
Well, a couple of points on that. Yes, I did. I would, go to the senior staff meeting in the morning. We would then prepare what the day was going to look like for the president. Invariably, we would go in and the president would have some kind of public event or a photo opportunity or something. So we would go in and talk to him about, here are the questions that the press are going to shout at you today when you do whatever event you're doing. You're honoring the 4-H queen, but the press is going to be in there and ask you about something else. So we had a very, very good relationship, and I would go into him if I had not had if there was not some public event on his calendar before my briefing every day. I would take my briefing book into the Oval Office and go through it with President Clinton. I'd say, okay, here's the answer that we're going to give on this question, that question. And sometimes he would say, well, that's just bullshit. and my answer would be, well, that's our policy. And so he would pick up the phone and call like the Secretary of Health and Human Services or call someone else in government and say, well, Mike's got to go out and answer this question. And, we got to have a better answer to the question than the one we got here. And so it helped drive policy. I mean, I think that's one of the critical aspects of the job is that being accountable to the media, which, they're there to be surrogates for the American people, and coming up with better answers to tough questions actually improves the functioning of government and has the effect of really, getting more efficiency in the system and producing better outcomes. So I saw it as a very, very critical part of the policy making process. Now, but a point about the role that I saw myself playing, and I think the role of the press secretary, I would never participate in conversations about policy making. I would sit in on all the meetings. I'd sit in on National Security Council meetings, meetings of the cabinet, important meetings in the Oval Office, but I was always sort of, I viewed myself as being a fly on the wall. And President Clinton, at one point, we were talking at the time, there was, a nasty conflict going on in the Balkans, in Bosnia. And the president looked over at me and he said, well, Mike, you've talked about this. You've had to answer more questions about this than anybody in our government because you were at the State Department. What do you think? And I kind of mumbled some incoherent answer, I think. But I after the meeting was over, I went to President Clinton. I said, look, I appreciate you asking me my opinion on that issue, but I really prefer not to do that because I don't want to, in a meeting with your senior staff or with cabinet members, I don't want to take a position because then I'm worried that other people in the government will not share their information with me because they'll say, well, McCurry is on the other side of the issue. He doesn't agree with us on this. So, we have to kind of avoid dealing with him. And I wanted everybody to give me everything that they had, all their information, how they were arguing things. I wanted people to have some trust and confidence that I would be a even-handed broker when it came to answering the question. I was obviously going to answer the question the way the president wanted it answered that would reflect the president's decision. But I think having that kind of neutrality in the policymaking process is a very important part of the role because then you earn the trust of everyone that you work with and you're not seen as someone who's going to be an advocate for a particular point of view. I remember after I left the White House, people asked me, I'd start asking opinion, what's your opinion on this issue or that issue? And I suddenly realized I had no personal opinion on things because I had sort of divorced myself from any of that. So I had to begin coming up with my own theory of how things ought to work. Yeah, and that was a much different rule.
Yeah. And I'm going to totally jump ahead going from the 90s to today. So we're going to have a little bit of whiplash, but go to the campaign today. And I see a couple of questions in the Q&A. Dan's going to moderate those. So if people want to start putting questions in, we'll bring Dan back in about 5-10 minutes and then really try and, I'll open it up for everybody to ask their own questions. One of the things that, people say now is that the election is that Trump wants to make the election a choice between himself and Joe Biden. And if he can do that, and he can put Joe Biden in a corner and paint him as old and, creepy and sleepy, that he has a better chance of winning, and that what Biden needs to do is make it a referendum on Trump. You talk about 100,000 deaths, you talk about 38 million people unemployed. And so so for Biden, it's basically, stay in the basement, metaphorically, and let it all be about Trump. Do you think that that is too much of an oversimplification? And should that be Joe Biden's strategy if he wants to win?
Well, here's my general theory of what a winning presidential campaign has to consist of, and it starts with, first, you've got to demonstrate competency and ability to do the job. People want to know that whoever they're electing has got the chops necessary to actually be the chief executive of the country. So it's competency first. The second thing is character. Who is this person? Do I trust this person? Do I like this person? Likability is a big factor, I think, in presidential politics. And then the third, and I would argue is the most important thing, is vision. The vision thing, as George Bush once called it. It's like, what's going to be different about our country if this person becomes president? What's going to change in my life? How's it going to impact my family? Where are we going in the future? Way too many candidates for political office always start by talking about their biography and what they've done in the past. And of course, most people say, well, that's fine, but I really want to know what's in it for me, what's going to happen in the future. So if you run that kind of profile through what's going on currently, Trump has got some real problems demonstrating that he's been competent in the office itself. There have been a lot of mishaps. There are a lot of things almost daily that sort of suggest that he's not quite got it right when it comes to the work that he has to do. Character, obviously, and don't need to say much about that. There's some serious issues there. But on that vision thing, that's how Trump won in 2016, because he talked about, let's make America great again. He had a very powerful message about restoring some of America's greatness. Most Americans do want to believe that we are an exceptional nation, and they wanted something that would restore that. I mean, if you think back to 2016, it's hard to remember what Hillary Clinton's vision of the future was. I mean, her slogan, I think, was "Stronger Together."
Well, I was going to say it could be "I'm with her" too, was another one, right?
Yeah, well, it was "Stronger Together" or "I'm with her." But stronger together begged the question, stronger together to do what? What's going to change in our country? Here's Trump promising to make us great again, and that was an aspirational message that people responded to. So, I mean, that looking back at 2016, that kind of helped define a little bit what the outcome ended up being. Looking ahead to this election, we still have got some unanswered questions. Biden unquestionably has got competency covered. He's had a long career. He's successful. He's worked in the highest levels of government. Is expert on foreign policy. Obviously, was a competent vice president. I think people generally think he's a person of strong character. He's prone to make mistakes from time to time, but he owns up to them and apologizes when he goofs, which is something I think people find, important. But that vision thing is where he's got to fill in the blank. What is his presidency really going to be about at the end? What's going to change in America if he's elected? So he's got to, measure up in those qualities, and then take the case to Trump. So it's not definitely, it's going to be, it's going to be, frankly, a very ugly campaign because it's going to get very personal, and there are going to be a lot of personal attacks. And, Trump is a bare-knuckle fighter, very clearly, and knows how to throw very, very hard punches. And Biden's going to have to punch back. I just hope that at some point, that third element that I just described, the vision, what is the country about? Where do we want America to go? It's a very, very difficult time. American leadership is being challenged in the world. In your part of the world, we are being contested vigorously now by China, which clearly wants to be a major player in that part of the world. We've got, the pandemic that is really basically shut America down. We've got our economy is pretty much closed up, so we've got a severe economic crisis. So it's going to take, it's going to take some extraordinary leadership to work our way through the issues that this country faces right now. And, I think most Americans are going to sit back and say, we've got two candidates, both of them clearly flawed in some aspects, but which of the two of them are really going to help us get through this very difficult circumstance we find ourselves in this country? And, obviously I'm a Democrat. Obviously I would make the case that Biden is a better choice, but that's what people will be looking at. And people are, in the process of making that decision now. There'll be very few undecided votes when we get to November. But there'll be people looking for signals that kind of confirm what their choice should be. And you mentioned that I have played a role in the presidential debates. I think the debates are important not because people decide based on the debates how they're going to vote. They usually watch those debates and they already have a preferred candidate. But they're looking for I want reasons that reinforce the view that I have that this is the candidate I'm going to vote for. And then, of course, they want to see an agenda set. They want those debates to really lay out a roadmap for the future of the country. And when that happens, you've got some real opportunity to get things right in our politics. But that's what this year is about in the national politics of the U.S. What is really going to happen as we go through and make the decision about the future of the country in November.